The gunmetal sedan rolled to a stop outside a convenience store in South Los Angeles, its windows tinted dark enough to swallow the streetlights whole. The engine ticked as it cooled. Inside, the man stepped out alone. No driver, no escort, nothing but a long black coat and a posture that made grown men step aside without knowing why. His name was Minwoo. He walked into the store like he owned the air around him, picked up a bottle of water, paid in exact cash, and said nothing to the cashier beyond a small nod. 3 minutes. That was all he allowed himself in any one place. 3 minutes, then gone. Outside, 8-year-old Katrine sat on an overturned crate beside her mother's snack cart, swinging her legs, watching the street the way she always did. Not for fun, but out of habit. She had learned a long time ago that watching costs nothing and sometimes saves everything. That was when she saw him. A man in black gloves, moving low along the side of the sedan, glancing once toward the store, then sliding into the back seat like smoke finding a crack in a window. He pulled a folded blanket over himself and went still. No one else saw it. Not the security camera mounted dead and useless above the gas pumps. Not the 2 men arguing over a parking spot. Not Minwoo, who pushed open the glass door a moment later, water bottle in hand, mind already 3 steps ahead on a negotiation that hadn't happened yet. Katrine was off the crate before she decided to move. She crossed the sidewalk fast, sneakers slapping concrete, and caught him just as his hand touched the driver's door. "Sir." Her voice cracked from running. "Check the back seat." Minwoo froze. For a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts and built an empire out of never being surprised, the words landed like ice water down his spine. He looked at her. Really looked, searching for the lie children sometimes wore without knowing it. He didn't find one. He found fear. Specific fear. The kind you only have when you've actually seen something. His hand drifted slow toward the door handle. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from tonight. We'd love to hear from you. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button now, because what happens in the next 60 seconds is going to make you glad you didn't look away. The door opened. For one breath, nothing. Just the dark interior, the smell of leather, the blanket folded oddly in the back seat. Minwoo almost laughed at himself, almost turned to thank the girl, and explained that nerves did strange things to a man in his line of work. Then the blanket moved. It happened too fast for thought. A gloved hand shot out and seized his collar, yanking him forward. Minwoo's water bottle hit the pavement and rolled into the gutter. He twisted his body the way a decade of close calls had taught him to twist, drove his elbow backward into something solid, and felt the grip loosen for half a second. Enough. A blade flashed from his sleeve, more reflex than decision. The struggle was brutal and almost silent, the kind of violence that happens in seconds and feels like minutes. 2 men locked together in the open door of a car while the street around them kept walking, kept talking, kept living, unaware that a man's life was being decided 3 feet away. The attacker broke free first, stumbling back, pressing a hand to his side before melting into the alley behind the store. Gone. Just like that. Minwoo stood in the open door, chest heaving, one hand braced against the frame. Somewhere down the block, a siren rose. He didn't wait to find out who'd called it. He pulled the door shut, walked, didn't run, walked because running drew eyes to the far end of the lot, and was gone before the first patrol car turned the corner. Katrine watched him disappear into the dark the same way the assassin had. She didn't move from the spot until her mother called her name twice. She didn't tell her mother what she'd seen. Some instinct, older than her 8 years, told her this wasn't a story for tonight. 3 days passed before Minwoo allowed himself to think about anything except the obvious question. Who? He had not announced his trip to Los Angeles. Not to his rivals. Not to most of his own people. Only a handful of trusted names knew he had flown in under a different passport to broker peace between 3 organizations that had spent 2 years bleeding each other dry in the dark, away from headlines, away from anyone who'd notice or care. He had reduced his security on purpose. Fewer guards meant fewer questions at customs, fewer eyes that could later be turned into testimony. It was supposed to make him safer. Someone had used that against him. He sat in a rented apartment with the blinds drawn, turning the question over like a stone in his palm. 3 people in this city knew his schedule. 3. And one of them had either talked or sold him. He thought of the girl. 6 words and a stranger's instinct had bought him the half-second he needed to survive. He didn't believe in luck. He believed in causes. And he intended to find out what had caused an 8-year-old he'd never met to save his life. The street cart was easy enough to find. Min-woo returned the next afternoon in a plainer car, dressed down, watching from across the street the way a careful man watches anything he doesn't yet understand. Katrine was there, helping an elderly neighbor carry 2 heavy bags up the block before returning to lean against her mother's cart, calling out prices to passers-by in a voice too cheerful for how little money seemed to be changing hands. She wasn't performing kindness for anyone watching. She simply didn't know how to be any other way. He crossed the street. "You don't remember me," he said, which wasn't a question. She looked up, squinting against the afternoon sun, and something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition arriving slow, then all at once. "You're the backseat man. I prefer Min-woo." "Okay, Min-woo." She said it like testing whether the name fit him, decided it did, and went back to arranging paper cups on the cart. He should have left it there. Instead, he found himself asking the question that had kept him awake 3 nights running. "How did you know about the car?" Katrine shrugged the way children shrug when a question feels too obvious to deserve a real answer. "I watch people's feet. Their feet. My daddy used to say, faces lie easy. Feet don't know how." She straightened a stack of napkins that didn't need straightening. That man had on boots. Real expensive ones, the kind with the thick sole, made for running and not getting tired. Didn't match his clothes at all. Everybody else was looking at his face, trying to figure out if he looked nervous. I just looked down. Min-woo said nothing for a long moment. In his world, men trained for years to read a room the way this child read it without trying. "Your father taught you that." Something flickered across her face. Quick, there and gone. The particular kind of quiet that children develop around loss. "He's not here anymore. I'm sorry. It's okay. I still listen to what he taught me." That's kind of like having him here a little. He didn't have a response for that. He paid for 2 cups of lemonade he didn't want, left a bill far larger than the price, and walked away telling himself he wouldn't be back. He was back within the week. He told himself it was strategy at first. A man in his position couldn't afford loose ends, and a child who noticed tactical boots beneath a blanket was, by any reasonable measure, a loose end worth understanding. That was the story he repeated to himself on the drive over, and again while he waited in line for lemonade, he had no intention of finishing. It stopped being strategy somewhere around the 3rd visit, though he refused to admit exactly when. "You're back," Katrine said, not looking up from the row of paper cups she was arranging by size for no reason he could identify. "I like the lemonade. You never drink it. You just hold it and let it get warm." He had no defense for that, so he didn't offer one. "My mama says you're either real lonely or real nice," Katrine continued, switching 2 cups around so the tallest one stood in the middle. "She can't decide which. What do you think?" Katrine considered the question with the same seriousness she seemed to give everything. "I think you're both. I think being lonely makes people forget how to be nice, but you didn't forget all the way." Min-woo found himself without a response more often around this child than he had been in any boardroom in a decade. Her mother's name was Adiz, a woman who had built a small business out of nothing but flour, sugar, and the kind of stubbornness that refuses to quit even when quitting would be easier. She worked from before sunrise until the streetlights came on, and she did it alone because Katrine's father had died for years earlier and left behind love instead of money. Min-woo learned all of this slowly, in pieces, the way Adiz offered information to a stranger who kept showing up and buying lemonade he never finished. He worked construction, Adiz told him once, not because he'd asked directly, but because some silences invite a person to fill them. Came home every night covered in dust, smelling like sawdust and sweat, and somehow still found the energy to chase Katrine around the living room before dinner. Accident at the site took him from us. Quick. No warning. One day he was teaching her how to tie her shoes, the next he was gone. "I'm sorry," Min-woo said, the words feeling small against the size of what she described. Don't be sorry. Be present. That's worth more to people like us than sorry ever was. She said it without bitterness, the way a person states a fact they made peace with a long time ago. Their apartment, when he finally saw the outside of it, was small and the paint was peeling near the windows, but there were drawings taped to the walls and a smell of something always cooking and a particular kind of warmth that no amount of money had ever bought him. He thought of his own home, 3 floors, glass and steel, silent except for the staff who moved through it like ghosts trained never to be noticed. He had built that silence on purpose once. Now it felt less like peace and more like an empty room he'd locked himself inside. He began helping the way careful men help, without leaving fingerprints. An anonymous payment cleared the family's overdue rent. A repair crew showed up one morning to fix the cart's broken wheel and refused payment, claiming it was already covered. Boxes of supplies appeared at the back door of small grocers, prepaid, redirected quietly toward Adie's stall. Katrine had no idea who he really was. She believed, as far as he could tell, that he was simply a lonely businessman who liked lemonade more than a man his age should. He let her believe it. If you're enjoying the story so far, do us a favor and tap that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need a story like this one. Now, back to the warehouse district, where the men who failed to kill Minwoo were about to receive some very unwelcome news. 3 men sat around a table in a room with no windows, the air thick with the smell of cigarettes and unspoken blame. He's alive, one of them said, like the words tasted bad in his mouth. We know he's alive, snapped another. We want to know why. Maybe the man isn't as untouchable as everyone keeps insisting, the first one muttered. Maybe we've been afraid of our reputation instead of a man. Careful, the older man said, without raising his voice. Reputations get built on bodies. His is no exception. The third man, older, with the stillness of someone who'd survived worse meetings than this one, slid a single photograph across the table. Grainy, pulled from a gas station camera angled just well enough to catch a small figure sprinting toward a parked sedan. This is why, he said. A child. Silence settled over the room like dust. One of the younger men leaned forward, squinting at the photograph like it might rearrange itself into something less inconvenient. She's just a kid. She probably doesn't even understand what she saw. It doesn't matter what she understands, the older man said. It matters what she can describe to the wrong person, on the wrong day, in front of the wrong camera. Find her, he said finally, quietly. She's seen too much, and seen people who matter. No one in that room said the word kill. They didn't need to. Some instructions arrive fully formed in the space between sentences, understood by everyone present without ever being spoken aloud. The man who followed Katrine home from school 3 days later wore an ordinary jacket and ordinary shoes, the kind designed specifically not to be remembered. He kept half a block behind her, patient, waiting for the moment the street emptied. It never came. A figure peeled off from a doorway across the street, one of several people Minwoo had quietly placed around the neighborhood without explanation, men paid generously to simply exist nearby and watch. The follower noticed the shift in the air a half-second too late, turned, and found himself looking at someone twice his size with absolutely nothing friendly in his expression. The man ran. He didn't get far before vanishing into a side street, and whether he escaped clean or simply knew better than to be caught, no one could say for certain. Katrine never knew how close she'd come. She walked home swinging her backpack by one strap, humming something off-key, completely unaware that her life had just balanced for a moment on the edge of a knife she couldn't see. Minwoo received the report that evening and sat with it longer than he expected to. This had stopped being about him. The realization arrived heavy and uninvited. A child was now in danger, not because of anything she had done, but because of the one decent thing she had chosen to do. Kindness, it turned out, carried its own kind of risk. He thought about walking away, disappearing back to Korea, letting his organization handle threats the way it always had, with force, with finality, with the kind of solution that never required him to feel anything at all. Instead, he picked up his phone and made a call he should have made days earlier. The name that kept surfacing in every quiet inquiry he made was one he didn't want to hear. Hyun-suk had served beside him for over a decade, through wars fought in boardrooms and wars fought in alleys, through years that had turned a working partnership into something closer to brotherhood. He had been at Min-woo's side during the worst of it and never once flinched. The evidence, when it came, arrived the way betrayal always seems to, quietly, in fragments, refusing to form a complete picture until it suddenly, devastatingly did. A travel itinerary that only 3 people had access to. A wire transfer routed through an account that traced back, eventually, impossibly, to a name Min-woo had trusted with his life more times than he could count. He stared at the documents on his screen for a long time, willing them to mean something else. They didn't. He remembered a night years earlier, in a city he no longer let himself think about often, when Hyun-suk had stepped between him and a blade meant for his throat and walked away with a scar he never once complained about. He remembered toasts at celebrations, quiet conversations on long drives, the particular kind of trust that gets built only by surviving things together that should have killed you both. None of that trust explained a wire transfer with Hyun-suk's fingerprints all over it. It can't be him, he said aloud to no one, in an apartment too quiet to argue back. But the numbers didn't care what he wanted to believe. Katrine found him sitting on the steps outside her building one evening, the kind of stillness on his face that even an 8-year-old could recognize as something heavier than tired. She sat down beside him without asking permission, the way children do when they've decided someone needs company whether they ask for it or not. "You look sad," she said. "I'm thinking. About sad things? About complicated things." She considered this with the seriousness of someone twice her age. "My mama says complicated things are just sad things wearing a disguise." Min-woo almost smiled. "Almost. Can I ask you something?" Katrine said. "You usually do. Why do people who have a lot of money always look so sad? You got nice shoes and a nice car, and you still look like somebody took something from you." The question landed somewhere he didn't have an answer prepared for. He sat with it the way he'd been sitting with the betrayal, turning it, examining the edges, finding no comfortable place to set it down. "I think," he said slowly, "some people spend so much time protecting what they have that they forget to ask whether it ever made them happy in the first place." "That sounds lonely." "It is." She didn't say anything else. She just stayed there beside him until the streetlights came on, and somehow that was enough. He walked home that night thinking less about Hyun-suk's betrayal and more about every choice that had led him to a life where an 8-year-old's company felt more honest than a decade of partnership. The full plan revealed itself 2 days later, buried in encrypted messages Min-woo's people finally managed to crack open. The failed attack outside the convenience store had only ever been phase 1, a calculated risk Hyun-suk had been willing to accept, because even if it failed, it would expose how thin Min-woo's security really was. Phase 2 was simpler and far darker. Remove the witness. Let the blame fall on a rival organization already primed for war. Let that war consume the very alliance Min-woo had flown across the world to build. And in the chaos that followed, step quietly into the empty seat at the head of the table. Min-woo read the plan twice, then a third time, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less monstrous. They never did. He picked up the phone to warn Adiz. He was 30 seconds too late. Katrine didn't come home from school. Her mother called once, twice, a dozen times, her voice rising with each unanswered ring until the panic in it became its own kind of language. By the time Min-woo arrived at the apartment, Adiz was standing in the doorway with her phone pressed so hard against her ear it had left a mark on her skin, repeating her daughter's name like a question the world refused to answer. "She always comes straight home," Adiz said, and then again, quieter, like saying it twice might make it true. "She always comes straight home." Min-woo felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Not fear for himself, which he'd grown almost comfortable carrying, but fear for someone else entirely. It was heavier than he remembered fear being. "This is my fault," he said. Adiz looked at him like she didn't yet understand what he meant, and wouldn't have the strength to be angry about it even if she did. "Find her," she said. "Whatever this is. Whoever you are. Find her." He didn't correct her. He didn't have time to explain who he really was, and some part of him suspected she already knew more than she'd admitted to herself. He left the apartment and made calls he hadn't made in years. Calls to men who owed him favors older than Katrine herself. Calls that traded in information instead of violence, because for once, brute force wasn't going to be fast enough. We're getting close to the part of this story you've been waiting for, so if you don't want to miss how this ends, make sure you're subscribed and your notifications are on. Drop a comment letting us know. Do you think Min-woo finds her in time? Now, let's go back to the warehouse. It took 6 hours for phone calls and one very frightened informant to trace the trail to an abandoned shipping warehouse near the harbor, the kind of place that existed in every port city, forgotten by everyone except the people who needed somewhere forgotten to do their work. Min-woo arrived as the sun dropped low over the water, casting long shadows across rusted containers stacked 3 high. He moved alone at first, the way he always preferred to move into uncertainty, his men positioned at a distance, waiting for a signal. Inside, the warehouse smelled like salt and motor oil and old rope. Katrine sat in the corner of a small office, hands bound loosely in front of her, more frightened than hurt, her chin lifted in the particular defiance of a child who has decided crying won't help and refuses to give anyone the satisfaction anyway. Hyun-suk stood near the window, watching the harbor like a man already rehearsing his exit. You shouldn't be here, Hyun-suk said without turning around. And you shouldn't have touched her. Hyun-suk finally turned, and for the first time in 10 years, Min-woo searched his old friend's face and found a stranger looking back. You built an empire on instinct, Hyun-suk said. I built 10 years of loyalty on patience. Tell me, which one of us was actually wasting their time? You could have come to me. If you wanted more, you could have asked. You don't share power, Min-woo. You allow people to borrow it, and you always take it back when it's convenient. His voice carried no anger, which was somehow worse than if it had. I was tired of borrowing. I gave you everything a partnership could offer. Authority. Trust. A seat at every table that mattered. You gave me a leash with excellent craftsmanship, Hyun-suk said. It was still a leash. And the girl? Where does she fit into 10 years of grievance you never once spoke aloud to me? Hyun-suk's jaw tightened, the first crack of something that might have been regret showing through. She wasn't supposed to matter. She was supposed to be a detail nobody noticed, same as the boots under that blanket should have been a detail nobody noticed. I didn't plan for either of you. Katrine watched the exchange from the corner, silent, eyes moving between the two men like she was trying to memorize every detail in case it mattered later. Maybe she already understood, in the simple way children understand things adults overcomplicate, that this was a conversation about something much larger than the two voices having it. Let her go, Min-woo said. This was never about her. It became about her the moment she saw what she wasn't supposed to see. Hyun-suk's eyes flicked, briefly, toward the girl. I didn't plan for a child to ruin a year of careful work. I'll admit that much. I underestimated one thing. And what was that? A little girl. Min-woo took a slow step forward, close enough now that the years of history between them felt like something physical in the room, pressing against both of them. No, he said quietly. You didn't underestimate a little girl. You underestimated courage. There's a difference. Something shifted in Hyun-suk's expression, not quite doubt, but close enough to its neighborhood. It was the distraction Min-woo's men needed. They moved in from a side entrance, fast and coordinated, and the confrontation that followed was over almost before it began. A brief, controlled struggle, the kind that ends in restraint rather than bloodshed, because Min-woo had given very specific instructions about what tonight was and was not allowed to become. Hyun-suk didn't fight long. Some part of him, perhaps, had been waiting to be caught for longer than he would have admitted. Min-woo crossed the room and knelt in front of Katrine, working the rope free from her wrists with hands that were, for the first time in longer than he could remember, shaking slightly. You came, she said, like she'd never doubted it. I came. I knew you would. You always come back for the lemonade. He laughed, a short, surprised sound that took even him off guard. Let's get you home. Adiz met them at the door and didn't ask a single question before pulling her daughter into an embrace tight enough to make up for every unanswered phone call. Minwoo stood back, watching, feeling like an intruder on something too pure for a man like him to be standing near. Adiz finally looked up at him over her daughter's shoulder. "Who are you really?" "Someone who owes your daughter more than I can ever repay." It wasn't an answer. It was the truth, which sometimes has to be enough. The months that followed were not loud. There was no dramatic announcement, no public reckoning broadcast for anyone to see. Minwoo simply began, piece by piece, dismantling the parts of his organization built on fear instead of necessity, quietly redirecting resources, severing ties that had outlived any purpose beyond violence, choosing diplomacy in rooms where his name alone used to be enough. It wasn't weakness. People who knew him before would have struggled to recognize the difference, but he felt it clearly, every day, the particular strength it takes to walk away from power simply because you've finally understood what it costs. He never told Katrine who he truly was. Some truths, he decided, were a debt better paid in protection than in confession. He funded her education without ever putting his name on a single form. He watched, from a careful distance, as a frightened 8-year-old who once warned a stranger about a man in the back seat grew into someone who refused to look away from anything ever again. Years passed the way years do, quickly and then all at once. Katrine graduated at the top of her class, and the woman who walked across that stage carried herself with the same quiet alertness she'd had as a child, except now it had a name and a purpose. She had spent her years studying the kind of crime that hides in plain sight, the kind that depends on everyone else looking away. She had decided somewhere along the way that she would be the one who didn't. At the ceremony, scanning the crowd out of habit more than expectation, she noticed a quiet man sitting alone in the back row. Something about him tugged at a memory too old to place immediately. By the time she made her way through the crowd to find him, the seat was empty. On the chair where he'd been sitting, she found a folded note, the handwriting careful and unfamiliar. "You saved my life long before I saved yours. Keep protecting people. A grateful friend." She read it twice, then folded it gently and tucked it into her pocket, where it stayed for the rest of the night, warm against her like a secret she didn't need to solve to understand. People often imagine that heroes look a certain way, that courage arrives wearing a uniform or carrying a weapon, or commanding the kind of respect that fills a room before a word is spoken. But sometimes a hero is simply a child who refuses to stay silent when silence would have been so much easier. Katrine had no badge, no title, no power beyond the courage to speak 6 quiet words when everyone else around her looked the other way. Those 6 words changed the fate of a man feared by thousands and proved, in the end, that the smallest act of bravery can echo through more lives than we'll ever know. If this story moved you even a little, let us know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. Give this video a like if you believe small acts of courage deserve to be told, and subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, because there's always another story worth telling.